Hi, everyone. We're getting ourselves sorted out here. Nancy Leffler and Dan Leffler from Being with Grief for our October, I said that several times, August, changing the conversation about grief.
Your Steins have been involved in this. But
Thank
to,
you. Thank you for joining us today. If you're watching this live, remember you can put your comments in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll call on you. We want to make this as interactive as possible. If you're watching it at the replay, you can put your questions in the Facebook group or reach out to one of us individually, and we'd be happy to answer your questions.
yes, and today we selected as our topic the myths of grief. And as Nancy likes to say, within each myth or story or fantasy, there is always a kernel of truth.
Yeah, and sometimes it helps to identify what that kernel of truth is, because that way we can get some more information on what we actually need. When does a myth become a problem? When it goes beyond the kernel of truth, when all we find ourselves doing is whatever the myth is. That'll be evident to you as we go through some of these and give you some examples.
Exactly. And for our first one, and you know our story. We lost our daughter 21 years ago, or almost 21 years ago.
Almost 22 years ago.
What, 22 years ago? That's right. And it devastated our lives. We just did not anticipate anything like that, even though the experience of grief, had been part of our lives, our parents and our grandparents. But the death of our daughter really struck us hard, and we found ourselves in uncharted territory.
Yeah, and so some of these myths of grief we found out, well, actually all the myths of grief we found ourselves doing at one time or another, and we want to share with you what they are and what some of our experiences with them is and how we move through them.
Exactly.
How do you move through something that's keeping you stuck in a place that doesn't serve you?
And a lot of this material is material that I learned through the grief recovery method. But we certainly recognized that these were things that had happened to us. And as we share our story and how they impacted our grief journey, we'll be able to, kind of round this out for you.
Yeah. So the first myth we're going to talk about today is staying busy. And that's one that I think we can all relate to in a busy world. We all tend to be busier than we need to, but why is it a detriment when we're grieving?
Well, again, for me, right after all of the ceremony and things that we need to consider are finally behind us. I took only a few days off before I went right back to work to keep busy and to keep my level of grief contained, and I compartmentalized it.
Yeah, and in our society, we're expected to go right back to work. We're given 2 or 3 days of time off for a funeral, and then we're expected to get back to normal or whatever that is. And it's when the myth of keeping busy is meant to keep us so occupied that we won't have time to think about grief. And that doesn't help, does it?
Well, no, because the grief is there regardless.
Yeah.
And Many times people have avoided bringing up a difficult subject, because they didn't know how we would take it,
Yeah.
and how it would make them feel.
Right, right, right. So if we stay busy, it helps them because they can stay busy with us.
Right, right.
Yeah,
And although going back to work that quickly, and even afterwards, the lack of concentration,
right,
which is a safety concern.
right.
It-
That ties into the statistic that the Grief Recovery Institute put out about the cost of unresolved or unrecognized grief on the workplace. It exceeds $116 billion a year, and they looked at things like lack of communication, concentration rather, poor decision making, and safety. And safety is tied into both of the previous ones, because if you're working on a building, say you're working on a roof and you're preoccupied, you may not put your
Harness.
harness on, right? Correct. And that could lead to an accident. So
And we've all seen those examples on Facebook, where a guy walks off the roof just because he's not paying attention.
right. So staying busy does not always staying busy for just the sake of doing busy work and distracting yourself is not always helpful.
Another one that ties in with this is the idea of being strong and shouldering the burden, no matter how heavy it is. And when you've lost someone, or any one of 40 different types of grief that can enter your life over a period of your lifetime, to I don't even know how to describe it.
Staying strong.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
impression that you have to be strong, and
Well, you thought you had to be strong for us.
but right, and to meet some image that I had in my head.
Right. And at that time, the last thing you feel like is being strong.
Right.
You don't feel strong on the inside. And so by being told by society that you have to be strong and soldier on, it's causing stress. So another one is grieving alone. That's something that Dan and I both did in a little different way. I tend to isolate anyway. And just a note here, the way you do one thing in your life is generally the way you do everything. So if there's a way that you respond or react to certain situations when you're stressed out, it's going to be you're going to be responding like you're on steroids in a big way. So I didn't want to interact with anyone, my family, my friends. I didn't want to go anywhere. I really didn't want to get out of bed because I thought my life was over, and I had no idea how I was going to get from that day to the next day, let alone here almost 22 years later. And I thought my life was going to be a shadow of what it was. It was going to be a hollow life where I was just existing from day to day.
Yeah, and it's like a rewrite on the story of your life. You no longer have a direction, and you're winging it. And the idea that you have to carry that burden and do it solely on your own can really be harmful. And you mentioned it too, that internalizing all of these feelings, it
Right.
acts like a pressure cooker,
Right.
and it can affect your health, and that can be a different kind of safety concern.
Right, right. So that leads to the next one, which is don't feel bad. You mentioned pressure cookers. So if you keep all of your feelings inside, especially the quote unquote bad feelings, you will feel like a pressure cooker because they eventually will erupt.
Mhm.
That's something that you talk about often, and it happened for me as well. We can't, if we don't meet our feelings, especially our uncomfortable and painful feelings, because we don't like to feel those, they will eventually erupt.
Yeah.
And they get louder and more intense to get our attention. So they're not really as overwhelming as we think they are. Because when we start to meet them and start to pay attention to them, they calm down a little bit.
That's really the basis of this whole idea of being in the present moment that you speak about in your work, and that has been one of the things that I think we've come to both understand is being present, and being willing to share deeply from a place of our own experience can be beneficial to you folks, and we hope that, again, this is an interactive opportunity. We want to make these conversations happen.
And part of the myth of denying our feelings is we think that if we don't feel them, that they'll go away. And we think if we don't feel them for long enough, they'll go away. And it's when they start getting louder to try to get our attention that we may realize that that's not necessarily true. And there's a big emphasis in our society to only feel the positive feelings. Think positive and you won't have to have those bad or negative feelings. I prefer not to call them bad or negative or put any kind of a label on them. They're merely feelings, and it's part of the full spectrum of feelings that we all have. A negative feeling or an uncomfortable or painful feeling is just that. And those are the ones that we don't like to feel because we haven't been taught the skills to be with those kinds of feelings. And that's one of the things that we do. We teach the skills to be with our feelings and to get better at feeling them rather than just feeling better.
Exactly. And another good example, of not being told not to feel bad is another myth. But I always think of the example because it happened to me. I had a terrible day at school. Like, I came home and my mom asked me, "How was your day?" It was terrible. Oh, don't feel bad. Here, have a cookie.
Right.
Let's substitute this, disappointment with this, reward or distraction.
Right. It's looked at as a I think our parents thought that would make us feel better, but they were discounting our bad feelings or our sad feelings or whatever it was. And those, we talk about that often, that those little disappointments are some of our early tiny griefs. What if our parents helped us to feel those feelings or be with those feelings or move through those feelings at the time that they happened? How would that change our relationship to a larger grief? What would that be like? We'd have the resources and skills to begin to meet grief in a much different way than we did when we experienced it.
And that's part of approaching with intention the idea of these complicated internalized feelings that need to be expressed, and creative ways of doing that, and logical step-by-step actions that you can take
Yeah,
that can lead you to a different alignment with that grief. It doesn't take the sadness away necessarily.
right. We learn how to be sad and how to be joyful at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. And early in my grief journey, I didn't know that. I thought that I couldn't be joyful again. I couldn't be happy again because I was so sad. I thought that that would never, that I couldn't see how that was going to happen again for me.
Yeah.
Another example of replacing the loss is using other kinds of distractions or diversion, whether it's watching TV or mindlessly scrolling Facebook for hours and hours and hours, or playing video games or going shopping or whatever we do. And it's not just good to avoid grief. We do it to avoid cooking dinner, cleaning house, or whatever we avoid. Those are things that may be ingrained into us. And again, because that's how we do one thing, that's how we do grief as well. So being aware of the things that we use as distractions, and knowing that it's okay to be distracted sometimes. You know, we can't live in grief 24/7. So knowing when we need to turn the TV off and begin to examine some of our feelings.
Yeah, it's what I like to say. You become aware of this uncomfortable feeling that you need to deal with. You then look to see what options and how can I change that alignment to something that's more positive. Do I really need to hold on to these feelings of sadness when I have such good memories of the person I lost? Or it could be any one of things: moving to a different city,
Right.
starting a new job, and
Yeah.
a divorce. There's
Yeah, loss of a pet. There's
loss of your health.
yeah, there's um so many times that we experience grief. You know, we think that grief is only the death of a loved one. And then we begin to realize that there's many other times that we go through grief. You know, COVID, the pandemic, has brought up so much grief. And last month we talked about that in greater depth. So these are some of the things that we think about when we're talking about myths. The last one we want to talk about is time heals all wounds. We hear that one a lot. Time heals all wounds, and it sounds good, right? I mean, enough time goes by, everything's going to be okay again. However, it's not just the time. It's what you're doing with that time. It's learning the skills to meet the grief. One of the examples that I like to use with this one is, say you break an arm. If you did nothing to it, it would probably heal in some fashion, but you may not be able to use it in the way that it's intended to be used. But if you go to the doctor and he sets it and you keep it still in the cast for however long, it will be useful again. So the same is true of grief. Learning the skills to meet your feelings, to question your life. One of the questions I like that you ask is, what's next?
Right. Yeah. Because for me, again, grief or the death of our daughter was an aha moment. It stopped me in my tracks, made me take an evaluation, and I was faced with that question: what is next?
Yeah, it's kind of like that moment in between the way your life used to be and the way your life will be, where you get to decide if you're going to be willing to do the work to figure out if there's meaning and purpose, if you can find meaning and purpose again and live a full life, or if you're going to stay over here. And it's not something that we can answer for you. That's a question that you have to answer for yourselves. And it's not easy. You know, sometimes I think it would have been so much easier if I had stayed in bed, hadn't gotten out, and I hadn't met my feelings and did this work, because it's not easy. Yet it's led to us living a full life, a life with meaning, purpose, and joy.
Exactly. And, you know, that's goes into what I was saying. First was that awareness that, you know, I've got to do something. Then I had to align myself with, you know, what that choice was going to be,
Yeah.
so that I could take the steps necessary, the actions that would help us complete with the painful feelings,
Mhm.
you know, but some sadness and, you know, and thoughts of all the things that could have been.
Right.
But there are
Right.
ways and to look at those and work through those feelings, which is, you know, the deep work that we do.
Yeah. And I like when you share about how you're learning to walk. We were watching our granddaughter learn to walk about a year ago, and she and I'm sure you've watched toddlers learn to walk. They first they start pulling themselves up, and then they start standing, and they don't realize it, and they fall down, and so they do it again, and then they do it again, and they do it again, and they don't say, "Oh, I'm stupid, I can't walk," because I didn't do it on the first, second, or third try. They continue to walk, and she was just so gleeful and happy about being able to stand up and walk 2 or 3 steps. So that's the skill that she has, to be able to now run faster than we can across the room. So when you're learning these things, it's not, we may not get it on the first, second, or third try. It's something that we keep returning to for several reasons, because it's a skill and because it continues to arise. Now, we still are grieving. Grieving is an action.
And there are those moments when you realize, oh, I'm doing this, and
Yeah.
I have that choice, and we always have choices.
Right.
Making good ones and informed ones, and, you know, things that are efficient, make sense. But, you know, life is life, and it throws you curves.
Right. And sometimes the smart thing to do is nothing. Don't be busy. Completely slow down, because that's when the feelings come. But knowing that, and then having the resources to meet it, is something that's useful. And it really helps once you start seeing what's possible. It's kind of like a snowball. You begin to accumulate confidence that you can do this.
I like that you frame it that way, because it helps to put that plot together. What was the other thing I was?
Let's, while you're thinking, I'm going to recap the myths. The myths that we talked about today were keeping busy, time heals all wounds, grieve alone, stay strong, don't feel bad, and replace the loss.
Yeah, and that grieve alone is kind of where I was going. Think of the situation where you know, you've experienced a loss. Maybe the last thing you want to do is get together with a bunch of people, but find a group where you can have these conversations. because, that's where, or a good friend, or a great partner. But it
Yeah.
took us each on our own separate journey. And, as we kind of wrap this thing up for this week, I think,
Mhm.
the thought that we each went on our own journey to
Yeah.
come to grips with the loss, because we each grieved Leah in our own unique way.
As
And
will you.
yeah, you'll find yourself with a solution one way or the other. And we want to help that be the best experience possible.
So take a look at the myths, see which ones might be playing out in your life right now. I'll put some writing prompts in the lesson for you to help you with that. Thank you for being with us this month, and we look forward to seeing you in the Facebook group. Please help us choose the next topic by telling us what you want to hear. If you have any questions or comments or anything that you would like the group's feedback on, please put them in the Facebook group. Or, as we said before, reach out to one of us if you would like to do that privately. Until next time, we're Dan and Nancy Leffler.
Thank you.